Picture this: a frozen lake in the dead of winter, somewhere deep in the Minnesota wilderness. The wind howls through the pine trees like a wounded animal, and the ice beneath your feet groans with a sound that makes your blood run cold. Now imagine finding a body frozen solid in that ice, eyes still open, staring up through 6 inches of crystalline death. That's how they found the first victim of Alvin Creeper Carlson. But that wasn't where his story began. No, the Creeper's tale starts long before the bodies started appearing. In a place where the cold wasn't just in the air, it was in the hearts of men. Before we descend into the frozen hell that was Creeper Carlson's reign over Minnesota's underworld, I want to know something. Where are you watching this from right now? What time is it where you are? Drop a comment below and let me know if you're brave enough to hear this story all the way through. Because once we start walking through the snow-covered streets of 1970s Minneapolis, following the bloody trail the Creeper left behind, there's no turning back. This isn't just another gangster story. This is the tale of a man who turned Minnesota's harsh winters into his own personal killing ground, who used the very landscape that shaped him as a weapon, and who earned a reputation so terrifying that even hardened criminals whispered his name with fear. So bundle up, turn up the volume, and let me take you back to a time when the Twin Cities had an underworld as cold and merciless as the winters that defined them. Asterisk. Alvin Carlson wasn't born evil. That's the thing people never understand about men like him. They're not born monsters. They're made, piece by piece, winter by winter, until the humanity freezes right out of them. And all that's left is something that looks human but doesn't feel human anymore. He came into this world on January 15th, 1948, in the middle of one of the worst blizzards Minnesota had seen in 50 years. His mother, Astrid Carlson, nearly died giving birth to him in their one-room shack on the outskirts of Duluth. There was no doctor, no hospital, just a midwife, who barely made it through the snowdrifts, and a father who was too drunk to care whether his wife lived or died. That father, Eric Carlson, was a dock worker when he could keep sober long enough to hold a job, which wasn't often. He was a mean drunk, the kind who didn't need much of an excuse to use his fists. Little Alvin learned early what the world was really like. He learned that weakness got you beaten. He learned that kindness was a luxury poor people couldn't afford. And he learned that in Minnesota, if you couldn't stand the cold, you wouldn't survive. His childhood was a blur of hunger, violence, and those endless winters that seemed to last 9 months out of every year. Eric would come home drunk and angry, looking for someone to blame for his failures. And Alvin was always there, an easy target. By the time Alvin was 8 years old, he developed a strange habit that would later give him his nickname. He moved quietly, unnaturally quietly. You'd never hear him coming until he was right behind you, and then you'd turn around and there he'd be, staring at you with those pale blue eyes that never seemed to blink. The other kids in the neighborhood started calling him Creeper because he'd creep up on them during their games, appearing out of nowhere like a ghost. They thought it was funny at first. Later, they'd realize it wasn't a joke at all. It was a survival skill he developed to avoid his father's fists. When Alvin was 12, something happened that changed him forever. It was February, one of those weeks where the temperature doesn't rise above 0 and the wind cuts through you like broken glass. Eric had been on a 3-day bender and came home in one of his worst rages yet. This time, he didn't go for Alvin. He went for Astrid. And this time, he didn't stop. Alvin watched his mother die on the floor of that shack, too afraid to intervene, too small to make a difference. Eric passed out next to her body, and Alvin sat there in the dark, listening to his father snore while his mother grew cold. Something inside him froze that night, something that would never thaw. The police called it an accident. Eric called it a tragedy. Alvin didn't call it anything at all. He just stopped talking for 3 months. That's when people started noticing something different about the boy. He'd always been quiet, but now he was silent. He'd always been good at sneaking around, but now he became invisible. Teachers would forget he was in the classroom. Eric would come home drunk and not even realize Alvin was in the room until the boy wanted him to know. And those pale eyes, they didn't look sad or angry anymore. They didn't look like anything at all. They were just cold. Eric died 2 years later. The official report said he fell through the ice on Lake Superior while drunk. He'd gone out onto the frozen lake despite warnings that the ice was too thin, and he'd fallen through and drowned. That's what the report said. But there were people who whispered other things. People who said they'd seen young Alvin out by the lake that night. People who said Eric's fall hadn't been an accident at all. People who said if you looked closely at Eric's body when they pulled it out of the water, you could see marks on his back, marks that looked like someone had pushed him. Nobody could prove anything, of course. Alvin was only 14. He gave his statement to the police with those dead eyes and that quiet voice, telling them he'd been home asleep and they had no reason to doubt him. Eric Carlson was a drunk who died doing something stupid. Case closed. But that's when the legend of the creeper really began, not with the first body they'd find years later, but with that cold February night when a 14-year-old boy might have murdered his father and gotten away with it. After Eric's death, Alvin became a ward of the state. They put him in a group home in Minneapolis, hoping the city would be good for him. It wasn't. The city taught him things the wilderness never could. It taught him about hierarchy, about power, about the pecking order that exists in every human society. The group home was full of damaged kids, but none were damaged quite like Alvin. While the other boys fought and screamed and acted out, Alvin watched. He learned who had power and why. He learned how fear worked better than friendship. And he learned that in the cold, people made mistakes he could exploit. By 16, Alvin had dropped out of school and was running errands for small-town criminals in North Minneapolis. Nothing big at first, just delivering packages, passing messages, keeping his mouth shut. But the gangsters noticed something about this quiet kid with the dead eyes. He never got nervous. He never asked questions. And he had a talent for appearing and disappearing like smoke. When you needed someone who could move through the city without being seen, the creeper was your guy. That's also when he started earning a different kind of reputation. There was an enforcer for one of the local crews, a guy named Tommy the Hammer Hendricks, who liked to push the young runners around, take their money, humiliate them. Everyone was afraid of Tommy, everyone except Alvin. One night in December, Tommy decided to teach the creeper a lesson. He cornered Alvin in an alley, started pushing him around, demanding his money. Alvin just stood there, taking it, those pale eyes staring up at Tommy without expression. Then, 2 days later, they found Tommy frozen to death in his car. The engine had been running, but someone had stuffed his exhaust pipe with snow. Carbon monoxide poisoning. The police ruled it an accidental death. Tommy had been drunk, passed out in his car. The exhaust got blocked by snow, and he died. But the word on the street was different. The word was that Tommy had messed with the wrong kid. The word was that the creeper had just sent a message. After that, people treated Alvin differently. They didn't push him around anymore. They didn't joke about his nickname. When he walked into a room, the temperature seemed to drop a few degrees. By the time he turned 18, Alvin Carlson had established himself as someone you didn't want to cross. He was still just a kid, really, but there was nothing childish about him. He'd been hardened by winters, both literal and metaphorical, shaped by violence and neglect into something efficient and cold. The old-timers and the fimers and the pemmers and the violence and neglect into something efficient and cold. The old-timers and the efficient and cold. The old-timers and the violence and the Collins and the violence and the Minneapolis underworld started using him for special jobs. When they needed someone to disappear, they called the creeper. When they needed to send a message that would make people's blood run cold, they called the creeper. And when they needed something done in winter, when the snow covered tracks and the cold preserved evidence in unexpected ways, they definitely called the creeper. Because Alvin had figured out something that would become his signature. In Minnesota, winter was the perfect time to kill. He understood the cold in a way most people didn't. He knew how bodies behaved when frozen. He knew how to use ice and snow to hide evidence or preserve it depending on what served him. He knew that in the dead of winter, people didn't go wandering around, didn't look too closely at things, just wanted to get inside where it was warm. Winter made people careless. Winter made people vulnerable. And winter was when the creeper was at his best. By 1970, at just 22 years old, Alvin Creeper Carlson had become one of the most feared enforcers in the Twin Cities. He didn't work for any one crew exclusively. He was a freelancer, which meant he was available to whoever paid him, and he didn't come cheap. His specialty was making people disappear in ways that would send a message. Bodies found frozen in lakes. Victims left in abandoned warehouses in the dead of winter. And always, that sense of cold calculation that made even hardened criminals nervous. But this was still just the beginning of the creeper's story. He was still small-time, still just an enforcer working for other people. What came next would transform him from a feared hitman into a legend and a nightmare that would haunt Minnesota for years to come. Because Alvin Carlson was about to step out of the shadows and build an empire of his own. One frozen body at a time. Asterisk. The year 1972 changed everything for Alvin Carlson. That was the year he stopped working for other people and started building his own operation. That was the year he went from being an enforcer to being a boss. And that was the year the bodies really started piling up. It started with a betrayal, or what the old guard considered a betrayal. Anyway, the Creeper had been working primarily for a crew run by Vincent "Vinny" Black Morrison, one of the major players in Minneapolis's organized crime scene. Vinny ran gambling, loan sharking, and had his fingers in several legitimate businesses that served as fronts. He'd been using Alvin for the dirty work, the jobs that needed a certain kind of coldness that Vinny's regular guys didn't possess. For 2 years, Alvin had been Vinny's go-to guy for problems that needed permanent solutions, but Alvin was watching, always watching. He saw how Vinny's operation worked. He saw the weaknesses, the inefficiencies, the places where money leaked away. He saw how Vinny's own sentimentality, his loyalty to men who'd been with him for years, but were now liabilities, was holding the operation back. And he saw an opportunity. The thing about the Creeper was that he didn't think like other gangsters. They were emotional, driven by pride and ego and ancient grudges. Alvin was pure calculation. He approached crime like a mathematician approaches a problem cold, logical, efficient. When he looked at Vinny's operation, he didn't see a family or a brotherhood. He saw a business that was being run poorly, and he knew he could run it better. In March of 1972, 3 of Vinny's top lieutenants disappeared within a week of each other. First was Danny Romano, who vanished after leaving a bar in northeast Minneapolis. They found his car 3 days later, abandoned near Lake Calhoun. No body, no blood, nothing, just an empty car with the keys still in the ignition. Then there was Marcus Gears Jefferson, who ran Vinny's chop shop operation. Gears left work one evening and never made it home. His wife reported him missing, but the police found no leads. Finally, there was Sean O'Malley, Vinny's bookkeeper, and the man who knew where all the money was hidden. Sean disappeared from his own apartment, leaving behind a half-eaten dinner and a TV that was still on. Vinny knew something was wrong, but he couldn't figure out what. His guys were disappearing like smoke, and there were no witnesses, no evidence, no demands. It wasn't a rival crew because nobody was claiming credit. It wasn't the cops because they were as baffled as everyone else. It was just happening. And with each disappearance, Vinny's organization got a little weaker, a little more paranoid, a little more paralyzed by fear. Then came the April thaw. That's what they call it in Minnesota, that time in spring when the ice finally melts and the lakes give up their winter secrets. And that year, the secrets were particularly grim. A fisherman found Danny Romano's body floating in Lake Calhoun. He'd been weighted down, but the weights had come loose. Marcus Jefferson turned up frozen in a block of ice in an abandoned meatpacking plant. And Sean O'Malley was discovered in the trunk of a car at the bottom of a partially frozen lake. All 3 had been dead since their disappearances. All 3 had been killed execution-style single gunshot to the back of the head. And all 3 had been preserved by the cold in ways that made it clear they'd been killed and stored deliberately. Kept frozen until someone was ready for them to be found. The message was clear. Even if nobody wanted to say it out loud, someone had systematically eliminated Vinny's top people. And they'd done it with a signature that everyone in the underworld recognized. The cold, the ice, the precise, emotionless efficiency. This had the Creeper's fingerprints all over it, metaphorically speaking. Because of course, Alvin never left actual fingerprints. Vinny Morrison was found dead in his own home 2 days after the last body was discovered. The official report said it was a heart attack. The stress of losing his people had been too much. But the people who saw the body knew better. There were signs of a struggle. And Vinny's face had that expression that people said showed up on all the Creeper's victims, pure terror. Frozen in place, with Vinny and his top lieutenants gone. There was a power vacuum in North Minneapolis. Normally, this would lead to a war between rival factions, everyone scrambling to grab pieces of the territory. But that's not what happened. Because the Creeper moved fast. Within a week of Vinny's death, Alvin Carlson called a meeting. He invited every major and minor player in the Minneapolis underworld crew bosses. independent operators, everyone who had a stake in the game. The meeting was held in a warehouse in northeast Minneapolis, a neutral location that nobody controlled. It was a bold move, the kind of thing that could get a man killed if he'd misjudged his position. But Alvin hadn't misjudged anything. People showed up to that meeting out of curiosity more than anything else. This quiet kid who'd been an enforcer was now calling plays, acting like he had authority. Most of them came planning to put him in his place, maybe even kill him if he got too uppity. But when Alvin walked into that warehouse and stood in front of 25 of the most dangerous men in Minnesota, something happened that nobody expected. He commanded the room without raising his voice. He laid out his vision with the cold precision of a surgeon. And he made it absolutely clear, not through threats, but through implication, that anyone who opposed him would end up like Vinny and his boys. The creeper didn't need to bluster or threaten. Everyone in that room knew what he was capable of. Everyone in that room had heard the stories. And everyone in that room had enough self-preservation instinct to know that working with him was smarter than working against him. Alvin's pitch was simple. He was taking over Vinny's operation. But he wasn't interested in turf wars or vendetta. He was interested in money. He proposed a new structure, something closer to a corporation than a traditional crime family. Everyone would maintain their own operations, but they'd pay a percentage to him in exchange for protection and coordination. He'd handle supply chains, he'd manage the cops, and he'd deal with any external threats. In return, they'd all make more money with less risk. It was so rational, so businesslike, that it almost didn't sound like organized crime at all. And that's what made it work. These men were criminals, yes, but they were also businessmen. And Alvin was offering them a better business model. By the end of that meeting, 20 of the 25 men in attendance had agreed to work with him. The 5 who didn't disappeared over the next month. Their bodies found in various states of frozen preservation around the Twin Cities, by the summer of 1972. Alvin Creeper Carlson effectively controlled most of the criminal activity in Minneapolis and was expanding into St. Paul. He was only 24 years old. He ran operations from a modest office in a legitimate trucking company, showing up in a suit and tie like any other businessman. He rarely got his hands dirty anymore. He had people for that. But everyone knew that if you crossed the creeper, you'd end up as another one of his winter victims, even if he had to wait for cold weather to make his point. What made Alvin different from other crime bosses was his absolute lack of flash. He didn't drive fancy cars or wear expensive jewelry. He didn't throw parties or maintain a public profile. He lived in a modest apartment in South Minneapolis and walked to work most days. To anyone who didn't know better, he looked like an accountant or a mid-level manager. But beneath that bland exterior was a calculating mind that was always 3 steps ahead of everyone else. He also instituted rules in his organization that other criminals found bizarre. No drugs around children. No hitting women. No unnecessary violence. These weren't moral positions. Alvin wasn't a moral man. These were practical considerations. He'd watched too many criminals bring heat on themselves through stupidity and excess. He ran his operation like a business, and business was good. By 1974. The Creepers network had expanded to include gambling operations. The Creepers network had expanded to include gambling operations, loan sharking, protection rackets, theft rings. and a sophisticated smuggling operation that brought goods in through the ports of Duluth. His annual income was estimated to be in the millions, though nobody could prove it because Alvin was meticulous about keeping clean books and washing his money through legitimate businesses. But success brought attention, and attention was something Alvin had always avoided. The FBI had started noticing the patterns in Minneapolis, the way crime had become more organized, more efficient, more controlled. They didn't know who was pulling the strings, but they knew someone was. Local police were asking questions about the bodies that kept turning up every spring when the ice melted. Journalists were writing articles about Minnesota's mysterious crime lord, the shadowy figure who seemed to control the underworld without anyone knowing his face. And that's when Alvin made his first real mistake. Because no matter how smart you are, no matter how careful, there's always something you don't see coming. For the creeper, it came in the form of a woman who would see past his cold exterior and find whatever humanity was left inside him. Her name was Maggie Sullivan, and she was about to become both Alvin Carlson's salvation and his ultimate vulnerability. Asterisk. It's strange how love can find you even in the coldest places. Alvin Carlson had spent his entire adult life building walls of ice around himself, convincing himself that emotions were weaknesses and attachments were liabilities. He'd created an empire built on fear and efficiency, a world where he was untouchable because he didn't care about anything or anyone. And then he met Maggie Sullivan, and all of that started to crack. She wasn't part of his world. That's what made it so unexpected. Maggie was a schoolteacher at an elementary school in South Minneapolis, completely removed from the criminal underworld that defined Alvin's life. She taught second grade, spent her weekends volunteering at the local library, and had never so much as gotten a parking ticket. She was everything Alvin wasn't: warm, open, genuinely kind. And he had no idea how to handle her. They met in the fall of 1974 at a coffee shop near Alvin's apartment. It was one of those random encounters that seem insignificant at the time but end up changing everything. Alvin was there doing legitimate paperwork for his trucking company, when Maggie sat down at the table next to him, grading papers with a red pen and occasionally laughing to herself at something a student had written. Her laugh caught his attention. It was the kind of laugh that came easily, without calculation or ulterior motive. It was genuine. Alvin hadn't heard anything genuine in years. When she dropped her pen and it rolled under Alvin's table, he picked it up and handed it to her. Their eyes met for just a moment, and Maggie smiled at him, not the nervous smile people usually gave the creeper when they sensed something off about him, but a real smile, warm and unguarded. She thanked him, asked if he was working on something important, and before he knew what he was doing, Alvin was having a conversation with her dot. It was the most normal conversation he'd had in a decade. She asked what he did, and he told her he ran a trucking company, which was technically true. She told him about her students, about the funny things kids say, about the challenges of teaching in an underfunded school. She talked about her dreams of traveling someday, of seeing places where it wasn't cold 9 months of the year. And Alvin, who never shared anything personal, found himself talking to her about growing up in Minnesota, about how you learn to love the cold even when it tries to kill you. They met at that coffee shop the next week, and the week after that. It wasn't dating, not officially. It was just two people who enjoyed talking to each other, who looked forward to those Thursday afternoon conversations in the coffee shop. Maggie had no idea who Alvin really was. To her, he was just a quiet, thoughtful man who ran a trucking business and seemed a little lonely. And Alvin had no idea what he was doing, stepping into something he couldn't control. Letting someone get close when he'd spent his entire adult life keeping everyone at a distance. By the time winter arrived, they were officially together. Alvin took Maggie to dinner at nice restaurants, brought her to classical music concerts at Orchestra Hall, walked with her around the frozen lakes, while she talked about her students and her dreams and the book she wanted to write someday. She made him laugh, actually laugh, not the cold approximation of humor he sometimes used for business purposes. She made him feel something other than that frozen emptiness that had lived in his chest since the night his mother died, for the first time in his life. Alvin Carlson started thinking about the future in terms other than business expansion and survival. He started imagining a different kind of life, maybe getting out of the game, leaving the criminal world behind, becoming the person Maggie thought he was. It was a dangerous fantasy for a man in his position, but he couldn't help it. Maggie made him want to be better. She made him remember what it felt like to be human, but the thing about building an empire on fear is that you can't just walk away from it. The organization Alvin had created ran smoothly, but it ran because people were afraid of him. The moment he showed weakness, the moment anyone sensed he was getting soft, the whole thing would collapse. And there were people, ambitious people, dangerous people who were already looking for opportunities to take what he'd built. Alvin kept his two worlds completely separate. Maggie never met any of his business associates. He never brought her to any location connected to his criminal operations. He maintained his reputation on the streets as the cold, calculating creeper while being someone completely different with her. It was exhausting, living these two lives, but he managed it. He had to, because losing either one would destroy him. But secrets have a way of coming out, especially when people are watching. And there was someone watching the creeper very carefully. Detective Michael Mick Callahan of the Minneapolis Police Department. Callahan was the head of the organized crime unit, a cop who'd been trying to nail the creeper for 3 years. He knew Alvin Carlson was the man behind the recent consolidation of criminal activity in the Twin Cities. He knew about the bodies that turned up every spring. He knew about the rackets and the operations, but he couldn't prove any of it. Alvin was too careful, too smart, too insulated behind layers of legitimate businesses and subordinates who would never talk. But then Callahan noticed something interesting. The creeper, who'd always maintained complete anonymity, who'd never been photographed at any criminal activity, who lived like a ghost, this man was suddenly spending time with a schoolteacher. Regular time, in public places, acting like a normal person. And Callahan, who was a good cop, but also a ruthless one, saw an opportunity. He started building a file on Maggie Sullivan, where she worked, where she lived, who her friends were. He started photographing her meetings with Alvin, documenting their relationship. And he started thinking about how he could use this information. Because if the creeper cared about this woman, really cared, then she was a vulnerability. And vulnerabilities could be exploited. The winter of 1974-75 was particularly harsh. Temperatures stayed below zero for weeks. The snow piled up until some streets became impassable. It was the kind of winter that killed the weak and tested everyone else. And in that frozen hell, Alvin's two worlds started colliding in ways he couldn't control. One of his subordinates, a young enforcer named Jackie the Snake Malone, started making moves without authorization. Jackie was ambitious and stupid, a dangerous combination. He'd been trying to establish his own operation on the side, skimming money from the creeper's take, building relationships with suppliers that should have gone through Alvin. It was the kind of betrayal that would normally result in Jackie becoming another spring thaw discovery. But this time, Jackie did something clever. He found out about Maggie. In January, Maggie started receiving strange phone calls. Someone would call her apartment late at night and hang up when she answered. She mentioned it to Alvin, concerned but not really frightened. He told her it was probably a wrong number, but internally his blood ran cold. He knew what this meant. Someone in his organization had discovered his vulnerability and was sending him a message. Alvin moved fast. He had his people find out who knew about Maggie, who'd been following him, who'd been asking questions. The trail led to Jackie Malone. And for the first time in years, Alvin decided to handle something personally. Because this wasn't business anymore. This was personal. This was about protecting the only thing in his life that mattered besides survival. On a February night when the temperature was 20 below zero, Alvin paid Jackie Malone a visit. What happened in that meeting, nobody knows for certain. But Jackie's body was found 3 days later in his car, frozen solid, parked in an alley in North Minneapolis. The message was clear. The creeper was still the creeper, still capable of the same cold brutality that had built his reputation. Anyone who thought he'd gone soft was making a fatal mistake, but that incident rattled Alvin in ways he wasn't used to. For the first time, his two worlds had touched, and the collision had nearly destroyed what he valued most. He realized that as long as he was in the game, Maggie would never be safe. People would always see her as leverage, as a way to get to him. He needed to make a choice, the life he'd built or the woman he'd fallen in love with. Maggie's reaction wasn't what Callahan expected. She didn't faint or cry or become hysterical. She just went very still, her face pale but composed, looking at the photographs spread across the table like they were from a different universe. And then she said something that would define what came next. "I need to talk to him myself. Miss Sullivan, I have to warn you. I'm going to talk to him," Maggie repeated, her voice steady despite the tears starting to form in her eyes. "If what you're saying is true, I deserve to hear it from him. And if it's not true, then you're harassing an innocent person." Callahan couldn't stop her. He'd given her the information, hoping she'd become a witness, an informant, leverage against Alvin. Instead, she stood up, thanked him coldly for his time, and walked out. She went straight to the trucking company where Alvin kept his office. Alvin was in a meeting with Victor and 2 other lieutenants, discussing their strategy against the Donnellys, when his secretary called to tell him Maggie was in the lobby asking to see him immediately. The fact that she'd come to his office, something she'd never done before, set off alarm bells. He told his people they'd continue later and went out to meet her. One look at Maggie's face and Alvin knew. She knew. Somehow she'd found out. He took her into his private office, closed the door, and waited for her to speak. "Is it true?" Her voice was shaking now, the composure starting to crack. "Are you?" The things that detective said. Are they true? Alvin could have lied. He was good at lying. But looking at Maggie, at the woman he'd been planning to spend the rest of his life with, he found that he couldn't do it. For once in his life, the ice inside him cracked and something human emerged. Yes, he said simply. It's true. What followed was one of the most painful conversations of Alvin Carlson's life. Maggie asked questions, and he answered them, not all of them, not the worst details, but enough. Enough for her to understand that the man she'd fallen in love with was a stranger, that the life they'd been planning was built on lies, that everything she'd believed about him was false. Did you ever actually love me? She asked, finally, and there was something broken in her voice. Or was I part of some plan? I love you, Alvin said, and the words came out with more emotion than he'd expressed in decades. That's the only real thing in my life. Everything else is business, survival, playing a role. But what I feel for you, that's real. How can you love anyone when you do the things you do? Maggie was crying now, tears streaming down her face. How can you talk about building a life together when your hands are covered in blood? Alvin had no answer for that. He'd spent years convincing himself that his emotions were dead, that he was just a machine optimized for survival. Maggie had proven him wrong, had shown him he was still capable of feeling. But now those feelings were destroying them both. I'm leaving, Maggie said finally. I'm leaving Minneapolis. I have family in Seattle. I'm going there, and I don't want you to contact me. I don't want to know where you are or what happens to you. I just want to forget that any of this ever happened. Maggie, don't. She held up her hand, stopping him. Don't make this harder than it already is. You can't be who I thought you were, and I can't be with who you actually are. So we're done. That's the only way this can end. She walked out of his office, out of the building, out of his life. And Alvin Carlson, the man who'd faced down hardened killers without flinching, who'd built a criminal empire through pure cold calculation, stood there and felt something inside him break in a way that wouldn't heal. But Alvin didn't have time to process his grief. Because while he was losing Maggie, his organization was under attack, and his enemies were closing in from multiple directions. The Donnellys had taken advantage of his distraction to hit 2 more of his operations. Detective Callahan was preparing warrants for Alvin's arrest, and some of his own people, seeing weakness in their boss for the first time, were starting to have conversations about whether it was time for new leadership. That night, Alvin sat alone in his apartment, surrounded by the ghosts of the life he'd almost had. Wedding invitations that would never be sent. Plane tickets for a honeymoon that would never happen. Dreams of a future that had evaporated like morning frost. And as he sat there, something shifted inside him. The thaw that Maggie had created was over. The ice was reforming, harder and colder than before. He'd tried to be human again, tried to build something beyond fear and violence. And it had cost him everything. The woman he loved was gone. His enemies sensed weakness. His organization was fracturing. All because he'd made the mistake of caring about something other than survival. That night, the creeper died. Not Alvin Carlson, he was still alive, still breathing. But the version of himself that had believed he could be better, that had imagined a life beyond the criminal underworld, that had dared to hope for redemption, that person was gone. What was left was something colder, more ruthless, more dangerous than anything that had come before. By morning, Alvin had made his decisions. He wasn't running away. He wasn't handing over his operations. He was going to war against the Donnellys, against the police, against anyone who thought they could take what was his. And when he was done, when the spring thaw came next year, the bodies they'd find would send a message that would echo through the criminal underworld for decades. You don't mess with the Iceblood Killer, because that's what the newspapers were starting to call him now. After a reporter made the connection between all the frozen bodies and the mysterious crime boss. The Iceblood Killer. Alvin Carlson. The Creeper. He had so many names, but they all meant the same thing: terror walking in human form. A force of nature as cold and merciless as a Minnesota winter. The war was about to begin, and it would be unlike anything the Twin Cities had ever seen. Asterisk, what happened over the summer and fall of 1975 would be remembered as one of the bloodiest periods in Minneapolis history. A time when the criminal underworld erupted into open warfare and the bodies piled up faster than the authorities could count them. Later, historians and crime writers would call it the Frozen War, even though it happened during the warm months. Because the man at its center was Alvin Carlson, the Creeper. The Iceblood Killer, and everything he touched turned cold. Alvin's first move was surgical and brutal. 2 days after Maggie left him, the Donnelly brothers' top enforcer, a man named Patrick "Paddy" McGrath, was found dead in his hotel room. The police report said it was a heart attack, but the people who saw the body knew better. Paddy's face was frozen in an expression of absolute terror, and the room's thermostat had been cranked down to its lowest setting. The message was clear: the Creeper was back, and the cold mercy he'd been showing was over. 3 days after that, 5 of the Donnelly soldiers were killed in a coordinated strike. 1 was shot leaving a restaurant. 2 more were killed in their car at a stoplight. The other 2 simply disappeared, their bodies turning up weeks later in circumstances that made it clear they'd died badly. The Donnellys responded by sending more people up from Chicago, escalating the conflict. By June, there were shootings almost every week, territories changing hands, police sirens that never seemed to stop. But Alvin wasn't just fighting the Donnellys. He was also conducting a purge within his own organization. Anyone he even suspected of disloyalty, anyone who'd questioned his leadership during his distracted period, anyone who might be talking to the police, they all disappeared. Victor Reyes, who Alvin had been planning to hand the organization to, was found dead in his home in early July. The official story was that Victor had been skimming money and was killed for his betrayal. The real story was more complicated. Victor had been loyal, but he'd also been the one person who knew about Alvin's plan to leave the life. And now that Alvin had decided he wasn't leaving, Victor was a liability. The police were overwhelmed. Detective Callahan was working 18-hour days trying to build cases against both the Creepers organization and the Donnellys, but every witness disappeared or refused to talk. Every lid dead-ended, every piece of evidence vanished into thin air. Callahan was starting to realize he'd miscalculated badly. He'd thought exposing Alvin to Maggie would break him, would make him vulnerable. Instead, it had created something worse, a version of the Creeper with nothing left to lose. "He's lost his mind," Callahan told his partner over drinks one night in August. The old creeper was cold and calculating. This new version? He's taking risks, making it personal. It's like he wants us to catch him. Maybe he does, his partner replied. Maybe he's got a death wish. But Alvin didn't have a death wish. What he had was a burning need to prove something to himself, to his enemies, to the ghost of the life he'd almost had. He needed to show that his brief moment of human weakness was an aberration, that the creeper was still the most dangerous man in Minnesota. Every body, every killing, every act of calculated brutality was a statement. I am what I am. I tried to be something else, and it failed. So now I'll be the best at being this. The Donnellys, for their part, were starting to regret coming to Minneapolis. They'd expected to roll over a weakened organization. Instead, they'd kicked a hornet's nest, and the Hornets were winning. By September, Brian Donnelly sent a message through intermediaries. He wanted to negotiate a truce. Divide the territory, share the profits, end the bloodshed. It was a reasonable offer, the kind of deal that would have worked with any normal crime boss. Alvin's response was to personally kill Sean Donnelly, Brian's younger brother. He did it in broad daylight, walking into a restaurant where Sean was having lunch, shooting him twice in the head, and walking out before anyone could react. It was reckless, the kind of thing that could get him caught. But it accomplished two things. It showed the Donnellys that there would be no negotiation, and it reminded everyone in the criminal underworld that the creeper was still the creeper, still capable of the kind of audacity that made him legendary. Brian Donnelly's response was immediate and catastrophic. He put out the word that there was $1 million bounty on Alvin Carlson, dead or alive. Every hitman, every desperate criminal, every ambitious nobody suddenly had a reason to come after the creeper. It was a death sentence, the kind of thing that should have ended with Alvin dead within a week. But Alvin had been preparing for something like this his entire life. He went underground, moving between safe houses, never staying in one place for more than a day, trusting no one. And somehow, impossibly, he not only survived, he kept running his organization, kept eliminating his enemies, kept the war going. The police couldn't find him. The Donnellys couldn't find him. He'd become a ghost again, the way he'd been in the early days. Before he'd made the mistake of becoming visible. In October, something happened that changed the dynamic of the war. A journalist named Rebecca Martinez published an article in the Minneapolis Tribune titled "The Iceblood Killer, Minnesota's Most Wanted." It was the first comprehensive profile of Alvin Carlson, piecing together his history from childhood to the present, connecting him to dozens of unsolved murders, laying out the full scope of his criminal empire. The article included a photo, the first public photograph of Alvin Carlson, that most people had ever seen. The photo was from his youth, before he'd learned to avoid cameras entirely, but it was enough. Suddenly, the mysterious creeper had a face. Suddenly, everyone knew what Alvin Carlson looked like. The article made him famous in the worst possible way. People who'd never cared about organized crime were reading about him. The FBI got involved, launching a task force specifically to bring him down. The pressure on Alvin intensified from all sides, but there was one person who read that article with emotions more complicated than simple interest or professional concern. Maggie Sullivan, living in Seattle and trying to rebuild her life, saw Alvin's face on the front page of the Tribune. She read Rebecca Martinez's account of his childhood, the abuse, the poverty, the death of his mother, all the trauma that had shaped him. And despite everything, despite the lies and the betrayal and the horror of what he'd become, she felt something that surprised her: sadness. Not for herself, but for him. For the boy who'd been broken and had grown into a monster because he didn't know how else to survive. She wrote him a letter. She never sent it, but she wrote it, putting down all the things she wished she could say. That she understood how he'd become what he was. That she forgave him for lying to her, even though she couldn't be with him. That somewhere inside the creeper, she still believed there was some small piece of the man she'd fallen in love with. She wrote it all down, sealed it in an envelope, and put it in a drawer. A goodbye to a man she'd never really known. Back in Minneapolis, the war was reaching its climax. Brian Donnelly, enraged by his brother's death and frustrated by his inability to capture or kill Alvin, made a catastrophic mistake. He went to the press, giving an interview to Rebecca Martinez, where he essentially admitted to being a crime boss and vowed to personally kill the Iceblood Killer. It was a PR disaster and a legal nightmare. Within days, the FBI had enough to arrest Brian Donnelly on multiple charges. He tried to fight it, but the evidence was overwhelming. By November, he was in federal custody, facing charges that would put him away for decades. With Brian Donnelly gone, his organization collapsed. The Chicago outfit withdrew their people from Minneapolis, cutting their losses. The various soldiers and associates who'd come north for the war scattered, going back to Chicago or moving on to other territories. Almost overnight, the war was over. Alvin Carlson had won, though it was hard to call it a victory given the carnage. The final body count from the frozen war was never definitively established, but estimates put it somewhere between 30 and 50 deaths directly related to the conflict. Multiple families destroyed, millions in property damage, a city traumatized by months of violence. And at the center of it all, surviving against impossible odds, was Alvin Carlson, now the most wanted criminal in Minnesota. With every law enforcement agency in the state looking for him, Detective Callahan was close now, closer than he'd ever been. He'd been tracking Alvin's movements, identifying his safe houses, building a network of surveillance. He knew it was only a matter of time before he found the creeper. And when he did, Callahan was determined to make sure. Alvin Carlson faced justice for everything he'd done. As winter approached, that first snow in November that announced the season that defined Minnesota, Alvin was moving between safe houses, constantly looking over his shoulder, trusting no one. His empire was intact, his enemies defeated, but he was trapped. He couldn't run because running meant leaving behind everything he'd built. He couldn't surrender because prison was a death sentence for someone with as many enemies as he had. All he could do was keep moving, keep hiding, and wait for whatever came next. On a night in early December, with snow falling heavy and silent outside, Alvin sat alone in a safe house and thought about Maggie. He wondered where she was, if she was happy, if she ever thought about him. He wondered what his life would have been like if he'd never met her, if he'd stayed the cold, emotionless machine he'd been before. Would he be in this position, hunted by every law enforcement agency, having won a war but lost everything that mattered? The truth was that Maggie hadn't made him weak. She'd reminded him that he was human, that beneath all the ice was someone who could still feel. And that humanity, that brief thaw, had been both the best and worst thing that ever happened to him. Because now he knew what he was missing. Now he knew what a normal life could have been like. And knowing that made the cold, violent life he was trapped in even more unbearable. But Alvin Carlson was a survivor above all else. He'd survived an abusive childhood, survived the death of his parents, survived decades in one of the most dangerous professions in the world. He'd survived the Donnelly brothers and the police and his own moments of weakness. And he would survive this too, whatever this turned out to be. What he didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that the end was already in motion, set in place by forces he couldn't control and decisions made by people he'd never met. The winter was coming, the coldest winter Minnesota had seen in decades. And in that winter, everything would end. The empire, the legend, the man himself. All of it would freeze and shatter like ice under pressure. The final act of the Creeper's story was about to begin. Asterisk, the winter of 1975-76 came early and hit hard. By mid-December, Minneapolis was buried under snow, with temperatures dropping to 20 and 30 below zero. It was the kind of winter that old-timers talked about for years afterward, when the cold was so intense it felt alive, malicious, personal. For most people, it was a natural disaster. For Alvin Carlson, it was both a weapon and a prison. He was moving between 4 different safe houses, never staying in any location more than a couple of days. The FBI task force, led by Detective Callahan, was closing in. They'd identified most of his properties, tracked his financial transactions, built a comprehensive map of his organization. It was only a matter of time before they found him. And Alvin knew it. But even as the net tightened, Alvin couldn't stop being what he was. His organization still needed leadership. Decisions still needed to be made. Money still needed to be collected. He was conducting operations while on the run, using payphones and coded messages, staying one step ahead of the authorities through a combination of paranoia and careful planning. Asterisk. In January, something unexpected happened. A package arrived at one of Alvin's safe houses, delivered through a complicated chain of intermediaries. Inside was a letter, Maggie's letter, the one she'd written but never sent. Somehow, through channels Alvin would never understand, it had found its way to him. He read it alone in a freezing safe house on the outskirts of Minneapolis, and for the first time since she'd left, Alvin cried. Not a lot. He'd trained himself too well for emotional displays, but enough. Because the letter said everything he'd wanted to hear and nothing that could help him. She understood. She forgave him. But she was gone, building a new life far away from him. And there was no coming back from that dot. The letter changed something in Alvin. It reminded him that there had been a time, however brief, when he'd been more than just the Creeper, more than just the Iceblood Killer. He'd been someone's beloved, someone's hope for a better future, and that person, that version of himself, was gone forever. What was left was just the monster, brilliant and cold and completely alone. That same week, Detective Callahan finally got the break he'd been waiting for. One of Alvin's former associates, facing serious charges on an unrelated matter, decided to cooperate. He gave up the location of his safe house where Alvin had been seen recently. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Callahan assembled a team of FBI agents, SWAT officers, the best people available, and prepared for the raid that would finally bring down the Iceblood Killer. They hit the safe house on a Tuesday morning in late January, moving in fast with overwhelming force. But Alvin wasn't there. He'd left 3 hours earlier, tipped off by instinct or information or just dumb luck. What the police found instead was evidence, documents, weapons, enough to build multiple cases even without catching Alvin himself. They also found something unexpected, a wall covered with newspaper clippings about Maggie Sullivan, articles about her teaching awards, photos from school events, evidence that Alvin had been following her life from a distance even though he'd never tried to contact her. Callahan stood in that safe house looking at that wall and finally understood something about the man he'd been hunting. Alvin Carlson wasn't just a criminal or a killer. He was a deeply damaged person who'd found one thing that mattered to him and had lost it. It didn't excuse anything he'd done, but it explained him in a way that pure evil never could. He's going to make a mistake, Callahan told his team. Men like this, when they lose what they care about, they either give up or they go out in a blaze. Either way, we'll get him. Alvin knew the walls were closing in. He could feel it, the way an animal feels a predator getting close. He had one more safe house, a cabin in the deep woods north of Minneapolis, a place nobody knew about except him. He'd bought it years ago under a false name, kept it completely off the books, maintained it himself. It was his final fallback, the place he'd go if everything else collapsed. That's where he headed in early February, as the coldest part of winter set in. The cabin was 50 miles from the nearest town, accessible only by a rough road that was barely passable even in good conditions. In winter, it was completely isolated, which was exactly what Alvin needed. He'd stocked it with supplies years. Uggo food, water, weapons, everything necessary to survive for months if needed. His plan was simple: hide out until spring, until the heat died down, until he could figure out his next move. But Alvin had underestimated Callahan's determination. The detective had put together every piece of evidence, every transaction, every property record. And he'd found something interesting, a small property purchase from 15 years ago, paid for in cash by a dummy corporation that Alvin had used only once. It was a long shot, but Callahan had run out of other options. He assembled a small team, prepared for the worst possible conditions, and headed north. They reached the area around Alvin's cabin on February 10th, in the middle of a blizzard. The temperature was 30 below zero, and the wind was howling at 50 miles per hour. It was the kind of weather that killed unprepared people, the kind of environment where even small mistakes were fatal. Callahan's team set up a perimeter a mile from the cabin, watching, waiting for the storm to pass before making their move. But Alvin saw them. He'd been watching the woods with binoculars, paranoid and prepared, and he spotted the law enforcement vehicles even through the blowing snow. He knew what was coming. They'd wait out the storm, then come in the morning with overwhelming force. There would be no escape, no negotiation, just a final confrontation that could only end one way. That night, sitting in the cabin while the Phelan wind screamed outside, Alvin Carlson made his final decision. He thought about his mother, dead on the floor all those years ago. He thought about his father, falling through the ice on Lake Superior. Whether by accident or by Alvin's hand, it didn't matter anymore. He thought about all the people he'd killed, all the lives he'd destroyed, the empire he'd built on fear and cold calculation. And he thought about Maggie, living her life in Seattle, probably sitting in a warm house with friends, laughing about something, completely removed from the frozen hell he was trapped in. He could surrender, walk out with his hands up, face trial, spend the rest of his life in prison. Or he could go out his own way, on his own terms. One last demonstration that Alvin Carlson bowed to no one, not even death itself. The decision was easier than it should have been at dawn. As Callahan's team prepared to move in, one of the agents noticed smoke from the cabin's chimney had stopped. Then they saw flames, not from the chimney, but from the cabin itself. Alvin had set it on fire, destroying all the evidence inside, all the documents and records that could be used against his remaining organization. By the time Callahan's team could get close, the cabin was fully engulfed, the heat from the fire creating a bizarre pocket of warmth in the frozen wilderness. They found Alvin's body in the ruins after the fire had burned itself out and they could safely enter. He'd shot himself, a single bullet to the head, sitting in a chair facing the door. He'd chosen to end it himself rather than be taken. In his lap, partially burned but still readable, was Maggie's letter. His final act had been to read her words one last time. Detective Callahan stood over the body, watching as the crime scene technicians did their work, and felt something complicated: relief that the hunt was over, satisfaction that justice had been served in some form, but also a strange sadness. Because Alvin Carlson had been a monster, yes, but he'd also been a human being. Damaged, broken, shaped by circumstances into something terrible. And now he was gone, another victim of the cold that had defined his entire life. The news of the Iceblood Killer's death spread quickly. Some people celebrated, glad that one of Minnesota's most dangerous criminals was finally gone. Others were skeptical, wondering if it was really Alvin in that cabin, or if this was another trick by the creeper. But the dental records confirmed it. Alvin Carlson was dead at 28 years old, his brief, brutal life ended by his own hand in a frozen wilderness. His organization, without its leader, began to fracture. Some lieutenants tried to take control, leading to a brief period of violence before federal authorities stepped in and arrested most of the major players. Within 6 months, everything Alvin had built was dismantled. The empire was gone, broken up and absorbed by other organizations or shut down by law enforcement. Maggie Sullivan learned about his death from a news article. She was having breakfast in her Seattle apartment when she saw his face on the front page of the paper. She read the article quietly, put down the paper, and cried for reasons she couldn't fully explain. She'd known this was how it would end. Men like Alvin didn't get happy endings. But knowing it would happen and seeing it confirmed were different things. She'd loved him once, loved the person he pretended to be, or maybe the person he truly was underneath all the violence. And now he was gone, and she'd never know which version of him had been real. As winter began to release its grip on Minnesota, and the first hints of spring appeared, people started finding bodies again, the ones that had been frozen all winter, preserved by the cold until the thaw revealed them. It was the Iceblood Killer's final gift to the Twin Cities, one last reminder of his reign. But this time, there would be no new bodies added to the count. The killing was over. The creeper was dead. Minnesota could finally breathe again. In the years that followed Alvin Carlson's death, his story took on a life of its own. He became a legend in the Twin Cities, the kind of figure that gets talked about in hushed voices, whose exploits get exaggerated with each telling. Some people said he'd killed over 100 people. Others claimed he'd faked his death and was living somewhere tropical, laughing at everyone who'd thought they'd caught him. The truth, as always, was more complicated than the legends. Rebecca Martinez, the journalist who'd written the first comprehensive profile of the Iceblood Killer, published a book in 1978 called Frozen, the true story of Minnesota's most dangerous criminal. It became a bestseller, cementing Alvin's place in the pantheon of American crime figures. Martinez interviewed everyone she could find who'd known Alvin, childhood neighbors, former associates, law enforcement officials. She tried to understand how a boy from Duluth had become the creeper. Her conclusion was both simple and profound. Alvin Carlson had been shaped by cold. Not just physical cold, though the Minnesota winters had certainly played their part, but emotional cold, the absence of love, of warmth, of human connection in his formative years. He'd learned early that the world was a harsh, unforgiving place, and he'd adapted to survive in it. The monster he became wasn't born, it was made, piece by piece, winter by winter, until there was nothing left of the boy who might have been. But Martinez also wrote about Maggie Sullivan, about that brief period when Alvin had tried to be something else. She interviewed people who'd seen them together, who described a version of the creeper that seemed almost human. This was the most controversial part of the book, the suggestion that Alvin Carlson had been capable of love, of genuine human emotion. Critics said Martinez was romanticizing a killer. Supporters said she was simply telling the complete truth about a complicated man. Maggie herself refused to be interviewed for the book. She'd moved on with her life, eventually marrying a software engineer and having 2 children. She taught at the same school in Seattle for 35 years, became known as one of the best second-grade teachers in the district, lived a quiet, normal life. She never talked about Alvin, never acknowledged that connection publicly. The only people who knew about that chapter of her life were her husband, who she'd told everything before they got married, and a few close friends. But privately, Maggie never completely forgot him. In her study, in a locked drawer, she kept a small box with photos from their time together. The engagement ring he'd given her, which she'd never been able to throw away, and the letter she'd written him. Sometimes, late at night when she couldn't sleep, she'd take out these items and remember the man she'd known, not the creeper. Not the Iceblood Killer, but just Alvin, the quiet, thoughtful person who'd seemed so lonely and had made her laugh in that coffee shop all those years ago. Detective Callahan, who'd finally brought down the case that defined his career. Retired from the police force in 1982, he'd been haunted by the Carlson case in ways he hadn't expected. He'd thought catching or killing the creeper would bring satisfaction, closure, a sense of justice served. Instead, he found himself thinking about that wall in the safe house covered with clippings about Maggie Sullivan. He found himself wondering if things could have been different. If there had been some intervention point where Alvin could have been saved rather than stopped in his retirement, Callahan did something unexpected. He started a program working with at-risk youth in Minneapolis, specifically focusing on kids from abusive homes. He never talked about why he started this program, never made the connection explicit, but those who knew him understood. He was trying to prevent the next Alvin Carlson, trying to catch kids before the cold got into their hearts and froze them from the inside out. He died in 1995, respected and mourned, having saved more lives through his youth program than he probably ever took off the streets during his years as a cop. The physical locations associated with Alvin's story took on a strange significance. The cabin where he died became something of a dark tourism site, with people making pilgrimages to see where the Iceblood Killer met his end. The property owner eventually tore down the ruins and put up a gate, but that didn't stop the curious. The coffee shop where Alvin met Maggie closed in the 1990s. But before it did, it briefly tried to capitalize on the connection, putting up a plaque that read, "Meeting place of the Iceblood Killer and his lost love." The backlash was immediate and intense, and they took it down after a week. Some of Alvin's former associates tried to trade on their connection to him. A few wrote books or gave interviews, most of them exaggerating their importance in his organization or making themselves seem more sympathetic than they were. Others disappeared completely, trying to leave that chapter of their lives behind. The ones who couldn't let it go, who kept trying to rebuild some version of what Alvin had created, mostly ended up dead or in prison. The debate about Alvin Carlson's legacy continued for decades. Was he a monster who deserved no sympathy, a psychopath who killed without remorse? Or was he a product of his environment, someone who could have been different if circumstances had been kinder? The truth, as Martinez argued in her book, was probably somewhere in between. He'd done terrible things, caused immeasurable suffering, built an empire on fear and violence. But he'd also been a human being, capable of love and connection, who'd tried, however briefly, to be something better. In 2015, a filmmaker made a documentary about the Frozen War, interviewing survivors and law enforcement officials, piecing together that violent summer and fall of 1975. The documentary was critically acclaimed but controversial, with some critics arguing it glamorized violence and others saying it was an important historical document. What everyone agreed on was that it captured something essential about the case, the way Alvin Carlson had represented something larger than himself, a manifestation of the coldness that could exist in human hearts when circumstances stripped away everything soft and warm. The Minneapolis Police Department still uses the Carlson case in training as an example of how a patient, methodical investigation can eventually bring down even the most careful criminal. But they also use it as a cautionary tale about the limits of law enforcement, how by the time someone becomes a figure like the Creeper, it's often too late for anything except containment and eventual elimination. There's a strange postscript to the story that not many people know about. In 2010, 62 years old and terminally ill with cancer, Maggie Sullivan did something she'd resisted for 35 years. She drove back to Minneapolis, to the cemetery where Alvin was buried, not in the family plot with his parents, but in a small corner of a public cemetery marked with just his name and dates. She stood at his grave for a long time. This elderly schoolteacher who'd once been engaged to Minnesota's most dangerous criminal. She didn't pray or cry or make a scene. She just stood there, remembering a few months from decades ago when she'd believed she was in love with a quiet man who ran a trucking company. Finally, she placed a single flower on the grave, a lily, which had been Alvin's favorite flower, though she was probably the only person alive who knew that dot as she walked away. She thought about the boy Alvin had been before the cold got him, before the violence and the death and the empire built on fear. She thought about the man he might have become if things had been different. and she thought about the brief moments when he'd seemed truly happy. Sitting across from her in that coffee shop, talking about nothing important. Just two people enjoying each other's company. Asterisk. Goodbye. Alvin, she whispered, though no one was there to hear. I hope you found some peace at the end. Whether Alvin Carlson found peace is something we'll never know. The man who became the Creeper, the Iceblood Killer, Minnesota's most notorious criminal, he died alone in a frozen cabin, surrounded by flames and ice, having lost the only thing that ever mattered to him. His life was brutal, short, and violent. His death was on his own terms, which was perhaps the only victory he could claim. Today, more than 50 years after his death, Alvin Carlson remains a controversial figure. There are still people in Minneapolis who remember the fear, who recall when you didn't go out at night during winter, when every frozen lake might hide another body. There are still families who lost loved ones to his organization, still scars from the frozen war that never fully healed. But there are also people who see in his story a cautionary tale about how society fails its most vulnerable members, how a child born into violence and raised without love can become something terrible. They argue that Alvin Carlson didn't have to become the Creeper, that with intervention, with help, with even a small amount of warmth and guidance, he could have been different. We'll never know for certain. What we do know is that his story, this terrible, tragic story of a boy who became a monster and briefly remembered he was human, remains relevant. Because there are still children growing up in cold homes, emotional if not physical. There are still people being shaped by violence and neglect. And if we don't reach them, if we don't provide some warmth to counter the cold, then we'll create more Alvin Carlsons. Different names, different places, but the same essential story. That's the legacy of the Iceblood Killer, not just the bodies he left behind, not just the empire he built and lost, but the question his life raises: what do we owe to the damaged children who might become dangerous adults? How do we balance compassion with accountability? How do we remember the victims while understanding the victimizer? These are questions without easy answers, questions that each generation must grapple with in their own way. But they're important questions, and Alvin Carlson's story, however dark, however difficult, forces us to confront them. So here's what I'll leave you with. The cold is always out there. It's in broken homes and harsh environments, in poverty and abuse and neglect. And if we're not careful, if we don't actively work to bring warmth and connection and support to those who need it most, the cold will create more monsters, more creepers, more Iceblood Killers. The only way to prevent the next Alvin Carlson is to recognize the first one when he's still a child, still salvageable, still capable of becoming something other than ice. Asterisk, and there you have it, the complete story of Alvin Creeper Carlson, Minnesota's Iceblood Killer. A tale of cold brutality, brief humanity, and ultimate tragedy. This is what happens when the frost gets into someone's soul and never thaws. If you made it through this entire story, I want to thank you for taking this dark journey with me through the frozen underworld of 1970s Minneapolis. This is the kind of story that reminds us that monsters are made, not born, and that sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones who once tried to be good but failed. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of Minnesota's most notorious criminals, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. We've got dozens more stories like this tales from the shadows of history. the gangsters and criminals who shaped America's underworld. Drop a comment below and let me know what you thought of the Creeper's story. Or tell me which gangster you'd like to hear about next. And remember, stay warm out there. You never know when the cold might come for you. Until next time, this has been another tale from the dark side of history. Stay safe, stay smart, and keep listening to the stories that the history books don't tell.